It was a war that shocked the world, but few talk about it today. At the turn of the 20th century, two empires collided in a battle that would shape geopolitics for decades. One was ancient and vast, Russia, with its endless land and czarist ambition. The other was new to the imperial game, Japan, modernizing, ambitious, and underestimated by the West. When they clashed in 1904, it wasn't just a regional dispute over Manchuria and Korea. It was a war of pride, strategy, and identity. A war that saw trenches, torpedoes, and typhoons. A war that introduced the world to the rising power of the East. Yet today, it's barely a footnote in most history books. Why? What happened in the Russo-Japanese War? And why did the world choose to forget it? Today, we revisit a conflict full of daring moves, lost heroes, and lessons still echoing over a century later. Why nobody talks about it? The Russo-Japanese War should be one of the most talked about conflicts in modern history. It was the first time an Asian nation defeated a major European empire in modern war. It changed the balance of global power, and it was watched by the entire world as it unfolded. Yet today, most people know little or nothing about it. Why is that? First, timing. The war took place from 1904 to 1905, just a decade before World War I erupted. That global conflict would consume the world's attention and rewrite the entire geopolitical map. In comparison, the Russo-Japanese War began to seem like a prelude, a forgotten overture to a larger symphony of destruction. Second, the parties involved. Japan was still viewed by much of the Western world as a peripheral player, despite its impressive modernization during the Meiji Restoration. Russia, meanwhile, was stumbling toward internal collapse. The war ended up being overshadowed by the Russian Revolution of 1905 and later the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Historians and the press focused on domestic unrest and the fall of the czars rather than a war fought far from Moscow. Third, colonial discomfort. The West wasn't ready to acknowledge what the war revealed, that a non-Western power could not only modernize but surpass Europe militarily and technologically. Japan's victory shattered racist assumptions about Asian inferiority. Rather than celebrate Japan's success, many Western powers downplayed it. Even today, this war is not emphasized in schools or mainstream historical narratives. It doesn't fit cleanly into the Western story of empire, progress, and power. It's an uncomfortable reminder that empires fall, and sometimes they fall to underdogs. The war's complexity also plays a role. It involved diplomacy, espionage, naval warfare, trench warfare, and revolution. It doesn't easily reduce to a single storyline. There were no clear good guys or bad guys, and the region it concerned, Manchuria and Korea, was, at the time, seen by many outside observers as distant and hard to relate to. But perhaps the biggest reason it's forgotten is that there was no neat ending. The Treaty of Portsmouth, negotiated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his role, ended the fighting. But it left both sides frustrated. Russia had lost prestige, but kept much of its territory. Japan had won battles but didn't gain all it wanted. The result? Simmering resentment on both sides. It wasn't a conclusive storybook finish. It was the beginning of further unrest. The roots of war: pride, land, and ambition. To understand why Japan and Russia went to war, we have to go back to the 19th century. Japan had recently emerged from centuries of isolation, reopening to the world through the Meiji Restoration. In just a few decades, it had built a modern navy, a disciplined army, and a booming industrial economy. By the 1890s, Japan had steel factories, railroads, telegraph lines, and a conscription-based army that rivaled those of the West. It was hungry to prove itself. It had also begun to flex its muscles. By 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. The Treaty of Shimonoseki granted Japan Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and influence over the Korean peninsula. It was a bold statement to the world. Japan was no longer the secluded island nation of old. It was an emerging empire with modern ambitions. Russia, meanwhile, was an aging imperial giant. The Romanov dynasty ruled a vast expanse that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. But Russia was not content with its already massive domain. It sought warm water ports for year-round naval access, something it lacked in the Far East. The frozen port of Vladivostok wasn't enough. The target? Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula, a strategic harbor in southern Manchuria that promised access to the Yellow Sea. The geopolitical stakes were enormous. The Russian Empire wanted to project power deep into East Asia. To do so, it invested in the Trans-Siberian Railway, a monumental infrastructure project designed to link Moscow to the Pacific coast. However, the railway was incomplete, vulnerable, and not well equipped to support a full-scale military campaign. Yet Tsar Nicholas II and his advisors were eager to extend their influence into Manchuria and Korea. Japan watched warily. At the center of it all was Korea, a peninsula viewed by Japan as vital to its national security. Japanese leaders feared that if Russia gained control over Korea, Japan would be strategically surrounded. Korea was also a key source of raw materials and a potential market for Japanese goods. For Russia, Korea offered a stepping stone into the Pacific and a southern buffer to its empire. Diplomatic efforts were made. Japan proposed a formal recognition. Russia could have a free hand in Manchuria if it acknowledged Japan's interests in Korea. It was a reasonable offer on paper, but Russia saw Japan as inferior and unworthy of negotiation on equal terms. Stalling and expanding, Russia moved more troops into Manchuria, violating earlier agreements. In the West, most powers expected Russia to easily subdue Japan if conflict erupted. But Japan was watching and preparing. It wasn't just worried about territory, it was concerned with honor, independence, and national destiny. Having watched China crumble under Western pressure, Japan refused to suffer the same fate. The only way to avoid being colonized, it believed, was to stand up and be recognized as a global power. Then came the tipping point. On the night of February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. It was a calculated risk, timed to strike hard before Russia could reinforce its position. The attack crippled several Russian battleships and shocked observers around the world. Japan formally declared war on February 10th. It was an audacious move, but Japan had done its homework. Its ships were modern, its officers were well-trained, and its army was ready for a long, brutal fight. The world, still operating on 19th century racial assumptions, was stunned that a non-Western nation had dared to attack one of Europe's great powers. But Japan wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just about Korea or Manchuria. It was about proving that Asia could stand shoulder to shoulder with the West, that Japan deserved a seat at the imperial table, that it could no longer be ignored or patronized. Japan's modernization wasn't just economic, it was military, cultural, and deeply strategic. For Russia, the war quickly became a logistical nightmare. Troops and supplies had to travel thousands of miles across the still incomplete Trans-Siberian Railway. Communications were slow. Commanders in the field lacked coordination with leaders in St. Petersburg, and morale among Russian troops was low. Many were conscripts, poorly trained and ill-equipped for the terrain in Manchuria. Meanwhile, Japan's forces moved with purpose. They landed troops in Korea, pushed north through the peninsula, and clashed with Russian forces near the Yalu River in one of the first major land battles. Victory followed victory. Japan's soldiers were battle-tested, fueled by national pride and belief in the mission. Historian Jeffrey Jukes put it well in the Russo-Japanese War 1904–1905. Japan fought a total war. Russia fought a colonial war. That fundamental difference defined everything. Japan mobilized its entire economy, its industry, and its population for the conflict. Russia viewed the war as a distant frontier issue. In the end, the root causes of the war weren't just strategic, they were emotional. National pride, racial arrogance, imperial ambition, mutual suspicion, and above all, a collision between an aging empire and a rising one. It was East meeting West, but on East's terms. For the first time in modern history, the East struck first, and struck hard. Stories from the front, heroes, strategy, and stunning losses. The Russo-Japanese War was as brutal as anything seen in World War I, but 10 years earlier. It had trench warfare, modern artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, and staggering loss of life. One of the key battles was the Siege of Port Arthur. From August 1904 to January 1905, Japanese forces encircled and bombarded this heavily fortified Russian naval base. It was a nightmare of mud, blood, and attrition. The Japanese dug trenches, tunneled under Russian defenses, and launched repeated assaults. General Nogi Marisuke became a national hero in Japan, but at a tremendous cost. His army suffered close to 60,000 casualties during the siege alone. When the port finally fell, it was both a strategic victory and a symbol of Japanese tenacity. At sea, the Battle of Tsushima was historic. In May 1905, the Japanese Navy, under Admiral Togo Haihachiro, ambushed and destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk and 7 captured. Japan lost just 3 small vessels. It was the first time in history that an Asian power had completely destroyed a major European fleet. Togo became a legend, and his tactics would be studied by naval strategists for decades. But there was also stories of heartbreak, stories of frostbitten soldiers in Manchuria, of young men lost in the snow, and of civilians caught in the crossfire. This was a war waged with modern weapons but pre-modern medicine. The wounded often died from infection or exposure. There were moments of respect, too. At Tsushima, Admiral Togo ordered that Russian survivors be rescued and treated humanely. He recognized bravery, even in the enemy. These stories, the heroism, the suffering, the stunning tactics, should be in our collective memory, but they're not. How the war changed the world and got forgotten. The Russo-Japanese War did more than reshape East Asia. It shifted global power. First, it marked the end of Russian expansion in the Far East. The defeat triggered unrest at home. The 1905 revolution in Russia nearly toppled the Tsar. It forced reforms and concessions and exposed deep fractures that would explode in 1917. Second, it inspired colonized peoples worldwide. If Japan could defeat a Western power, perhaps others could too. Indian nationalists, Chinese reformers, and African intellectuals took note. The age of unquestioned Western dominance had a crack in it. Third, it fueled Japanese nationalism. Victory brought pride, but also a belief in destiny. Japan saw itself as the rightful leader of Asia. That mindset would grow in the decades ahead, eventually leading to imperial expansion and conflict in World War II. So why is it forgotten? Because its consequences were long-term and messy. Because the victors didn't get everything they wanted. Because the losers tried to bury the embarrassment. And because Western historians often overlook stories where the West isn't central. But forgetting this war means missing crucial lessons about hubris, modernization, and global dynamics. It was a war that looked forward, toward the total wars of the 20th century, and in many ways, it came first. Conclusion. The Russo-Japanese War wasn't just a military conflict, it was a hinge in history. It marked the fall of old empires and the rise of new powers. It showed the world that Asia would not be silent or submissive. But perhaps it is forgotten because it didn't fit the expected narrative, because it challenged assumptions and made the mighty look vulnerable. But in the smoke of Port Arthur and the waves of Tsushima, a new century was born. And in remembering this war, we remember that history's loudest lessons don't always come from the loudest wars. They come from the ones we almost missed. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about Japan and epic moments from its history, check out our book, The Japanese Empire, a captivating guide to the rise, expansion, and historical impact of Imperial Japan. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.